this video, I want to show you some examples, both historical and contemporary, of photographers who use their self as their subject. Many reasons why you might want to do a self-portrait. One advantage is you always know where you are. And of course, during our current time, self-portraiture might be almost a necessity. However, there's many other reasons, and there's many reasons if you do choose to do self-portraiture, I want you to think a little bit more deeply about the reasons or the concepts behind why we might choose ourselves as our own subject. So let's get started. The photograph you're looking at now is a photograph by the pictorialist photographer Anne Brigman. Now, photographers have been making self-portraits actually since the beginning. I wanted to move forward in time to the late 19th, early 20th century and not go all the way back to the beginning of it, just because I wanted to start with a photographer who made a series of photos that cumulatively are a project, that is, that add up and give us a larger sense of the subject, and the subject in this case being Anne Brigman herself. Anne Brigman was Californian. She was single, she was independent, she loved more than anything to backpack on her own or maybe with her sister into the Sierras. And these photographs are all taken in the Sierras while she was hiking or camping alone. So these have, although they're very, very romantic and pictorialist and seem almost to be about the female form itself, these are actually a declaration of her own independence, her sense of feminism, and her sense of owning herself. Oops, excuse me, I went on a little bit too far on that. We'll get to that photographer next. Let me just put these up together. She made these over a period of, I think, about 10 or 15 years. And they're very specifically part of this series that she did about this independent spirit. The varying colors, by the way, have to do with the varying ways that they've been reproduced. Her intention originally would have been to make these all very similar in tone. So that's Anne Brigman, very interesting photographer. Self-portrait. Just get out of here. So the next photographer, I'm not sure we have talked about her yet in this class, and I should say about them, because Claude Cahun is historically a non-binary figure, born as a woman or born into a female figured body. Claude chose to take on the non-gendered name Claude Cahun later in their life and made self-portraits that really talked about gender fluency and identity fluency as well. Sometimes dressing in costumes, changing their appearance in many ways. Claude Cahun was a really interesting artist and photographer who is really becoming much more well known. Multiple exposure, double portrait. The bulk of their work from this time period are self-portraits. Moving back and forth between the feminine, the masculine, and the neutral. Now, while Claude Cahun did not necessarily think of these as a specific body of work, her work over their lifetime was really very specifically about this self-identity, gender, and identity fluidity. Now, the next photographer, I'm going to show two different series, and you're familiar with her already. This is Cindy Sherman, and Cindy Sherman became very famous actually initially in the 70s for this very seminal series that she did called The Movie Stills. She made a series of self-portraits of herself in these situations that appear to be lifted from a movie or from an actual movie still. And yet these are all, none of these have anything to do with a specific movie. There's simply a moment that she's using as an ambiguous moment between one action and the next, the kind of liminal territory. And also the way that our very identities, our very personas are changeable. So she sees herself as being each of these characters and yet not having anything to do with these characters at all. Characters are sort of still and trapped within this one moment, whereas we actually fluidly move from moment to moment and identity to identity. So these were very famous. These were all in black and white. She did these early in her career. And you can see how these are considered a series. She actually did produce and exhibit these as a series as the movie stills. I think there are at least several dozen of them. There's quite a few, so I'm just showing you a handful. Now, the next group, I want to show you actually an installation view as well as the photos themselves. This is a later project by Cindy Sherman, and I'll come back to this installation view. This was the historical painting series where she uh, used costumes, artifice, makeup to make herself into what looks like an historical painting in the style of a particular painter. They don't refer to actual paintings, just as the movie stills don't refer to actual movies, but they have a lot of the ideas and the tropes and the staging of an historical painting. And they are made to look deliberately very, very false, just as the artifice of the people in these scenes in this era had their certain artifice, so that the photos and the photos have their own artifice. When they're installed, this is an installation view. They're printed very large. They're put into ornate frames and installed as a group. So this again is a version of a body of work. This next series is by Lucas Samaras. And Lucas Samaras for a long time was doing Polaroid self-portraits. He did a couple of different series. I'm going to show the ones here that are close-ups. And so this process, unfortunately, not something you could do anymore, but if you have access to some software, to Photoshop, and some experience with that, Darktable can do this too, you can work on manipulating or maneuvering these scenes. He would actually do this physically in the Polaroid. He would take a self-portrait with the Polaroid, and then this particular kind of Polaroid, which isn't available anymore, you could manipulate and move around. So this was an interesting concept of the self and the malleability and almost the opacity and invisibility of the self. And these also really sort of travel somewhere between being photographic, where you can see little bits and evidence of the photographic, and being painterly. So the next series is also a very famous series. I think I've shown you a couple of these before. These are by Francesca Woodman, who was a very, very young photographer who's become quite famous since her death. She made a series of self-portraits that she often did in abandoned properties, all about her own identity or sometimes lack of identity. She's sometimes disappearing into the furniture. She's examining herself in a mirror or disappearing behind it. One of my favorites, where she actually lies down on the ground, powders the ground, and gazes at her own outline on the ground. This really is reminiscent of another artist, Anna Mendieta, emerging from the wallpaper. And one thing to notice about Francesca Woodman is that she often is not, her face is not present in many of her photos. I would say, if you look at all of her body of work, her face is visible in maybe a third of them. So these are really an interesting comment on self-portraiture and this idea of portraiture that does not carry or contain a face. Okay, a couple more. Just a handful of photos by Dinh Le, who is a Vietnamese photographer. He exhibits often in the United States and very famous for these woven photos that often deal with the subject of the Vietnam War, but he has a handful of them that are self-portraits, photos of himself. He grew up between Buddhism and Christianity, between cultures, and he sees himself often being a hybridized version of those. So he made these woven photographs that he's quite famous for as self-portraits, where he's weaving his own identity together. And let me just get back to here so I could show you these together. Okay, and by the way, I have a student who's a former student in New York who's actually doing his own series of photographs, woven photographs, very much inspired by Dinh Le. Really interesting stuff. I'll see if I can dig those up. Okay, let's go to Alison Belcher, who made this series of self-portraits using a pinhole photograph, so super long exposures with light painting, moving very slowly, even double exposing herself, having a relationship with herself, ghosting herself. And again, a really interesting way to do self-portraits. Now, she worked on film with a pinhole and light painting. You could do this light painting digitally, or you could do this kind of self-portraiture in many other ways. And last, now I'm just showing you a handful of these, but I want to say that this is another life project. I'm showing you some specific examples of ones that are also composites. But Chuck Close has been making portraits of himself, photographically based, since very early in his career. And he has there's actually an entire catalog of his work. He had an exhibit that was all self-portraits. So you can see him aging here, younger and older, and these are all photographic. Some of his self-portraits are paintings. Some of them are more straightforward photos, but this was a series that, a collected series from various time periods in his life of himself done as a composite. So there you go, self-portraiture, definitely an option for your final project.